Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the heart of ancient Greece, a city of marble and myth, where democracy was born and philosophy thrived. But tonight isn't about golden temples or grand debates. Tonight, we stand atop the battered walls of Athens as it faces its darkest hour. Sparta is at the gates. The drums of war echo through the streets. Athens is outnumbered, outmatched, and the walls are beginning to crack. But still, they fight. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to relax, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in for tonight's journey. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far our stories reach across the world. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and imagine the scent of burning oil, the clang of bronze shields, and the shouts of defiance rising over the clash of swords. This isn't just a siege, it's a battle for survival, for identity, for the very soul of Athens. When the dust settles, only one question will remain: can a city built on ideals withstand the iron of Sparta? The first light of dawn crept over the jagged cliffs of the Aegean, painting the whitewashed stones of Athens in hues of amber and gold. From the highest point of the city, the Acropolis stood like a crown, its columns rising proudly against the morning sky. Below, the city began to stir, merchants setting up stalls in the agora, children chasing stray dogs through narrow alleyways, and blacksmiths stoking their fires to life. The scent of olive oil and baking bread drifted through the streets, mingling with the distant echo of temple bells. Life in Athens was a delicate balance between survival and philosophy, where grand ideas were debated as fiercely as territorial disputes. It was here that democracy took its first breath, where Socrates would soon challenge minds in the agora, and where the marble statues of gods watched silently over their mortal subjects. In the shadow of the Parthenon, a modest home made of sun-dried brick and wooden beams creaked awake. It was sparse, just a single room shared by an entire family, with rough stone floors and clay pots lining the walls. The shutters were thrown open to greet the dawn, letting in the salty breeze from the sea. There was no glass, only wooden slats to keep the goats out, and perhaps a whisper of cool air if the gods were kind that morning. Kallias, a young man of 17, blinked sleep from his eyes as he rose from the thin mat of straw that served as his bed. His shoulders ached from yesterday's labor, hauling water from the public fountain and helping his father patch the roof of their small home. He stretched, bones cracking, and splashed his face with water from a clay jar. The water was warm, left out in the sun the previous day, but it chased away the last threads of sleep. He heard his mother, Myrine, already at work grinding barley into flour. The rhythmic scraping of stone against stone was as much a part of his morning as the crow of the roosters. Myrine's hands were calloused from years of labor, her fingers strong and unyielding as she pressed the grain beneath the pestle. Kallias watched her for a moment, marveling at the precision of her movements. For her, this wasn't just work, it was survival. Outside, the city came to life. Neighbors called out to one another, their voices carrying across the narrow lanes. A group of men passed by, their sandals scuffing against the packed earth as they made their way to the agora. They would spend the day debating matters of the city, politics, philosophy, and the occasional scandal. Kallias envied them, the way they spoke so freely, their words sharp and deliberate. He dreamed of joining them one day, but for now, his place was here, hauling water and fixing roofs. His father, Lysias, emerged from the back of the house, stretching his broad shoulders. The lines on his face spoke of years spent under the sun, laboring in the fields and at the docks. He placed a hand on Kallias's shoulder, firm but not unkind. "The fountain won't fill itself," he said with a half-smile. "And the goats have already begun their mischief." Kallias nodded, grabbing the clay jars and slinging them over his shoulders. The path to the public fountain was well worn, cutting through the heart of the city where vendors already shouted the prices of olives and fresh fish. The smell of grilled lamb wafted from a nearby stall, making his stomach rumble. He hurried past, promising himself he'd steal a few moments later to savor the scent. The fountain stood at the center of the square, a massive stone structure adorned with carvings of Poseidon and his chariot. Water trickled from the mouths of stone lions, splashing into the basin below. Women gathered around, chatting and filling their own jars, their laughter light and melodic. Kallias joined the line, nodding in greeting as he lowered his jars into the cool water. "Up early again, I see," called a familiar voice. Kallias turned to find Thera, a girl from the neighboring street, her hands gripping a pair of clay jars nearly as large as her own frame. Her hair was tied back with a strip of linen, and a streak of dirt smudged her cheek. She flashed him a grin, sharp and unyielding. "If you're not careful, the gods might think you're eager to work." He chuckled, shaking his head. "If that's true, then the gods must be blind. I'd much rather be sleeping." Thera laughed, the sound carrying over the bustle of the market. "Careful, Kallias. Someone might mistake you for a poet with words like that." He rolled his eyes but smiled despite himself. "I think I'll stick to carrying water for now. Poetry pays less." "Only if you're bad at it," she shot back, her eyes gleaming with mischief. Kallias watched her for a moment longer than necessary, his hands still gripping the cool clay of his jars. Thera was bold in a way few others were, sharp-tongued and quick-witted, never afraid to speak her mind. It was something he admired, even if he would never say it aloud. "Come on," she said, nodding toward the market stalls. "Let's get this over with before the sun bakes us alive." Kallias hoisted the jars onto his shoulders, the weight settling across his back like an old companion. He fell into step beside her, weaving through the throngs of people with practiced ease. The day had barely begun, and already the city thrummed with life, the pulse of Athens beating strong and steady beneath the rising sun. But somewhere, hidden beneath the laughter of the market and the clatter of hooves on stone, there lingered a tension, an unspoken weight that pressed down on the city like a storm waiting to break. And Kallias, though he couldn't yet put it into words, felt its pull. The agora of Athens was unlike any place Kallias had ever known. It thrummed with life, a living artery of commerce and conversation that pulsed at the heart of the city. Merchants called out from their stalls, their voices thick with persuasion as they touted olive oil, fresh fish, and finely woven fabrics. The scent of roasted lamb and baked bread mingled with the sharp tang of brine from the fishmongers' stands. Beneath the canvas awnings, philosophers argued with the kind of passion usually reserved for battlefield speeches, their hands slicing through the air as if carving their ideas into the wind. Kallias and Thera wove through the bustling crowd, their clay jars still heavy with water sloshing against their shoulders. The morning sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down with the weight of a smith's hammer, but the agora was undeterred. It thrived in the sunlight, the stones beneath their feet warm and familiar. This was where ideas took shape, where power was brokered, and where the pulse of Athens beat the loudest. "Did you hear about the debate yesterday?" Thera asked as they stepped aside to let a group of soldiers pass, their armor glinting in the sunlight. Kallias shook his head, adjusting the jars on his back. Which one? There's always a debate. Thera grinned, her eyes glimmering with mischief. The one about citizenship. Some merchant was arguing that medics should have the right to vote. Nearly got himself thrown out of the square for it. Kallias chuckled, the thought absurd. Medics, foreigners who lived and worked in Athens, were essential to the economy but had no political power. The idea of them voting was as likely as Zeus himself stepping down from Olympus. And I suppose the philosophers were in favor? They always are, Thera replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Until it comes time to actually change something. Kallias smiled, but it was a distant kind of smile, the kind that hid longing beneath its surface. He had always admired the philosophers, the way they commanded attention, the way their words seemed to shape the very air around them. He often imagined himself among them, standing at the center of a crowd, his voice ringing out with authority and conviction. But dreams were fragile things in Athens, and water still needed hauling. They reached the edge of the market square where the fountain stood, a massive stone basin fed by underground springs, its waters cool and clear. A few women lingered nearby, filling jars and exchanging gossip, their laughter drifting on the breeze. Kallias knelt and dipped his jars into the water, watching as bubbles floated to the surface before popping with a soft plop. One day, he said quietly, more to himself than to Thera, I'd like to speak there. In the agora. Not just haul water through it. Thera glanced at him, her brow arched. And what would you say, Kallias? That barley bread is too hard and the water too warm? He shot her a look, but she only grinned wider. I'm serious, he insisted, his voice firmer this time. I want to do more than this. Thera's smile softened, her eyes thoughtful. Well, she began, her tone uncharacteristically gentle, I suppose even Socrates had to haul water once. Kallias laughed despite himself, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the fountain. I think he would have complained more. Thera nudged him with her shoulder. You complain enough for both of you. They filled their jars in silence for a while, the noise of the agora swelling and fading around them like the tide. Kallias watched as a group of men gathered near a shaded corner of the square, their voices low and intense. From his place by the fountain, he couldn't make out their words, but their posture spoke volumes, back straight, hands gesturing sharply, heads bent close together. It was the stance of men planning something important. Who are they? He asked, nodding toward the group. Thera followed his gaze, her expression darkening. Politicians. Or rebels, depending on who you ask. Kallias raised an eyebrow. What's the difference? Thera's grin returned, sharper than before. Whoever wins. He studied the men a moment longer, curiosity tugging at his thoughts. Politics in Athens was a dangerous game, played with words as sharp as any sword and alliances that shifted with the wind. Kallias had heard the whispers of unrest, disputes over land, taxes, and the growing power of Sparta to the south. Men like those gathered in the corner were the ones who set those whispers into motion. Come on, Thera said, nudging him again. Unless you want to be dragged into that mess. Kallias hesitated but then followed, the weight of the jars a familiar comfort against his shoulders. As they moved through the crowd, he cast one last glance at the men, their voices now rising in quiet intensity. He wondered what it would be like to be part of that world, where decisions were made with words and power shifted with the sharpness of thought. One day, he promised himself. One day, he would know. They continued down the narrow alleys that wound through the heart of Athens, past sun-bleached homes and market stalls shaded with linen. Kallias listened to the sounds of the city, the shouts of merchants, the laughter of children, the distant hum of debate from the agora. Athens was alive with possibility, its streets like veins carrying the lifeblood of democracy and philosophy. Thera's voice broke his thoughts. "If you ever do end up speaking in the agora," she began, her tone teasing, "promise me you won't bore everyone to death." Kallias smirked. "Only if you promise not to heckle me." Thera paused, feigning deep thought. "No promises." They laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. But as they turned the corner toward home, the laughter faded, replaced once more with the weight of jars and the dust of the street. Kallias's mind lingered on the men in the square, their hushed conversations and sharp gestures. Something was stirring in the city, something more than the usual debates and disputes. And Kallias, though he couldn't yet name it, felt its pull in the marrow of his bones. The sun hung heavy in the midday sky, casting long shadows through the narrow alleys of Athens. Kallias and Thera walked side by side, the weight of their jars now replaced with the lighter burden of empty vessels. The market buzzed around them, vendors barking out prices, children darting between stalls, and the steady hum of debate threading through the chaos like an invisible tether. They approached a shaded corner of the agora where an olive tree stretched its branches wide, its leaves shimmering silver under the sunlight. A group of men gathered beneath it, their voices hushed but tense. Kallias hesitated, glancing at Thera. "Those are the same men from earlier," he whispered. Thera's eyes narrowed. "Looks like they're still at it. Should we?" Kallias nodded before she could finish, curiosity pulling him forward. They moved carefully, slipping behind the cover of a tapestry vendor's stall, where bolts of crimson and ochre hung like the flags of distant empires. From there, they could just make out the words exchanged beneath the olive tree. "And if Pericles doesn't step down, we'll all suffer for it," one man growled, his fists clenched at his sides. He was tall and gaunt, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Another man, older with streaks of gray in his beard, nodded grimly. "The taxes alone are enough to starve half the city. And for what? More statues? More temples?" Kallias frowned, his fingers curling against the fabric of the tapestry. Pericles was the voice of Athens, the man who had led the city to heights of glory. To hear him spoken of with such disdain was almost blasphemous. "Do you hear this?" Thera whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Kallias nodded, his eyes fixed on the men. There was something dangerous in the way they spoke, a quiet rage simmering just beneath the surface. He knew that tone, he had heard it before, in the whispers of farmers driven off their land for taxes, in the murmurs of sailors who had seen their wages cut to fund Athenian warships. "The war with Sparta bleeds us dry," the older man continued, his voice low and heavy with weariness. "If Athens doesn't change course, we'll be buried beneath the weight of our own ambition." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small gathering. Kallias watched, transfixed, as the men exchanged nods and clasped hands in secretive grips. This was not idle talk. This was planning, an alliance forged in shadows, away from the grand debates of the agora and the eyes of the assembly. Thera leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "We should go," she whispered. "If they catch us listening." Kallias hesitated, the thrill of the secret pulsing through his veins. But she was right. He nodded, and they slipped back into the flow of the market, their footsteps blending with the rhythm of Athens. They walked in silence for a while, weaving through throngs of shoppers and dodging the occasional goat that had escaped its pen. Finally, Thera broke the quiet. Do you think there could really be a rebellion?" Kallias considered this. Athens was a city of ideas, of heated debate and philosophical sparring. But the idea of revolt? It felt foreign, like something that belonged to the distant lands Athens had conquered, not to its own streets. "I don't know," he replied, his voice quiet. "But it seems like some people want it." Thera frowned, her hands wrapped tightly around the handles of her jars. Wanting it and doing it are two different things. Athens, it's too strong. Too proud. Kallias nodded, though the memory of those men lingered, their whispered plans and hardened expressions etched into his mind. "Maybe," he agreed, though his voice wavered just enough for Thera to catch it. They reached the edge of the market, where the street narrowed into a cobbled path flanked by stone houses. Thera paused, glancing back toward the agora. "Do you think they'll do it? Try to overthrow him?" Kallias followed her gaze, his eyes tracing the lines of the Acropolis towering above the city, its columns stark and unyielding against the blue of the sky. "I don't know," he said finally. "But if they try, we'll hear it first." Thera's eyes met his, and for the first time that day, the laughter was gone. "And what will you do, Kallias? If it happens?" Kallias swallowed, the weight of the question settling heavy in his chest. He had never considered the possibility, not really. Rebellion was the stuff of stories, of distant lands and ancient myths. But now, with the memory of those men fresh in his mind, it felt closer. More real. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I'd want to be part of it." Thera stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something else, something like pride. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I guess you really are a fool." Kallias laughed, the tension breaking like a wave against stone. "I guess I am." They continued down the path, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the stones. But Kallias's thoughts remained tangled in the echoes of that conversation beneath the olive tree, the whispers of rebellion threading through his mind like a song he couldn't shake. Because sometimes, whispers were just the beginning. The agora simmered with the low hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional shout of a vendor hawking figs or a poet reciting lines of verse for coin. The midday sun burned overhead, casting long shadows across the columns that marked the perimeter of the square. It was here, amid the chaotic blend of trade and philosophy, that Kallias found himself drawn once more. Thera had left him at the edge of the market, muttering something about her father's temper if she lingered too long. Kallias had watched her go, her braids swaying with each step, before turning back to the agora. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that the whispers of rebellion had sunk their hooks into his thoughts, and he couldn't quite shake them. He wandered through the throng, weaving between merchants and philosophers locked in debate. The smell of grilled meat and ripe olives hung heavy in the air, mingling with the dust kicked up by the crowd. Kallias paused by a stall selling papyrus scrolls, their edges curled from the sun. The vendor, a wiry man with a crooked smile, caught his eye. "Ah, a young scholar," the man said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Perhaps something from Plato? Or maybe the works of Solon. A fine choice for a man with ambition." Kallias shook his head, though his fingers lingered over the smooth surface of the scrolls. "Not today," he replied, his voice softer than he intended. The vendor raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. Kallias stepped away, his gaze scanning the agora. He saw merchants counting coins, soldiers marching with polished armor, and women balancing clay jars on their hips as they bartered for grain. It was a dance he had seen 1,000 times before, a living tapestry of survival and routine. But it was the man under the olive tree that caught his attention. He stood alone, his back straight despite his age. His hair was silver, pulled back in a tight knot at the base of his skull, and his robes were simple but impeccably clean. He held no scrolls, no clay jars, no merchant's wares, only his hands, which gestured smoothly as he spoke to the handful of listeners gathered around him. Kallias edged closer, his curiosity piqued. The man's voice was calm, measured, each word carefully placed like stones in a riverbed. "The true strength of Athens," he was saying, "is not in its walls or its soldiers. It is in its mind. A city that thinks is a city that survives." One of the listeners, a younger man with a sharp jawline and skeptical eyes, scoffed. "And how does thinking defend us against Sparta? Or feed the poor? Words cannot hold back a spear." The philosopher smiled, his eyes creasing at the corners. "No," he agreed, "a spear can only be met with another. But tell me this, what builds the walls that keep the spears at bay? What drives men to defend their home? To suffer, to sacrifice? It is thought, my friend. It is belief. And that is more powerful than iron." Kallias felt the pull of those words, the way they hung in the air like a promise. He stepped closer, the cobblestones rough beneath his sandals. He watched as the philosopher continued, his hands moving with the grace of a poet. "Athens is an idea," he said, his voice steady. "An idea that men can be free. That they can speak, and that their words matter. That, my friends, is more powerful than any sword." Kallias's heart hammered in his chest. He had heard these words before, whispered among merchants, murmured in the shadowed corners of the agora. But here, spoken openly and without fear, they took on new life. The young skeptic crossed his arms, brow furrowed. "Easy to say from under the shade of an olive tree," he shot back. "Try telling that to the farmers losing their land to taxes. To the soldiers bleeding for a city that forgets their names." The philosopher did not flinch. "I tell them the same," he replied, his tone unyielding. "That they bleed for something greater than themselves. That their voices matter, even when drowned by the clamor of war. Athens is imperfect. But it is ours to shape." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Kallias could feel the tension in the air, the sense of possibility. He edged even closer, until he stood at the fringes of the group. His eyes were locked on the philosopher, who now studied the faces before him with quiet intensity. "And you," the philosopher said, his gaze settling on Kallias. "What do you believe? Is Athens worth the struggle? The sacrifice?" Kallias started, his cheeks flushing under the sudden attention. He stammered for a moment, his thoughts tumbling over one another. I don't know, he managed finally. But I want to. The philosopher's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. That, he said, is the first step. To want to know. Most are too afraid even for that. Kallias felt something stir within him, a flicker of pride mingled with unease. He opened his mouth to speak, but the philosopher had already turned back to the others, his voice rising once more above the hum of the market. Change begins with a question, he declared, his arms spreading wide. It begins with the courage to say, what if? The crowd began to disperse slowly, some shaking their heads, others nodding in agreement. Kallias lingered, watching the old man as he gathered his belongings, a simple satchel and a leather-bound book, its edges frayed with age. Kallias hesitated, then stepped forward. Wait, he called out, his voice louder than intended. The philosopher turned, his eyes curious. Yes? Kallias swallowed hard, his heart thrumming in his chest. I want to learn, he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. About Athens. About all of it. The philosopher studied him for a moment, then smiled. My name is Lysias, he said, extending a hand. And I would be glad to teach you, Kallias. Kallias blinked, stunned. How do you know my name? Lysias' grin widened. Athens is smaller than it seems, my friend. Walk with me. And so, with the sun still high and the agora bustling with life, Kallias took his first steps towards something greater. Beside him, Lysias spoke softly of democracy, of philosophy, of Athens and its promise. Kallias listened, the words sinking into his bones like roots into fertile soil. For the first time, the future felt less like a distant dream and more like a path, one that he was beginning to see, stone by stone. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the stone steps of the Pnyx. It was here, on this rocky hill west of the Acropolis, that the assembly met, thousands of Athenian citizens gathered beneath the open sky to debate, to decide, to shape the future of their city. It was the heart of Athenian democracy, the pulse of its politics. Kallias stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had followed Lysias up the winding path, past vendors selling dried figs and olive oil, past merchants haggling over the price of wheat and barley. The closer they got to the Pnyx, the thicker the crowd grew, until Kallias was pressed shoulder to shoulder with men from every corner of Athens, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, soldiers. All gathered for one purpose, to speak, to listen, to vote. Lysias stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the stone platform where orators would soon stand. This, he said quietly, is where true power lies. Not in the spear or the shield, but in the voice. Kallias watched as the first speaker stepped onto the platform, his robes immaculate, his posture proud. The crowd hushed, the hum of conversation fading to a murmur. The man raised his hands, palms open, and began to speak. Citizens of Athens, his voice rang out, clear and sharp against the wind. We gather here today not just to discuss policy, but to secure the future of our city. Sparta looms to the south, its warriors sharpening their blades, its generals plotting our demise. And yet, we squabble over taxes and temples while the wolves circle closer. A murmur rippled through the crowd, low and tense. Kallias felt it in his bones, the fear that crept beneath the surface of daily life. Sparta had always been there, a shadow on the horizon, a threat whispered in taverns and at the docks. But now it felt real, tangible, pressing. Pericles promises us strength, the orator continued, his voice rising. He promises us glory, a legacy that will shine for generations. But I ask you, at what cost? While he builds statues and temples, our sons march to war. While he feasts with philosophers, our farmers starve under the weight of his taxes. Kallias glanced at Lysias, whose expression remained steady, thoughtful. Do you believe him? Kallias whispered. Lysias smiled faintly. I believe that words can shape reality. But whether they speak truth, well, that is for Athens to decide. The orator paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. I say enough, he declared, his voice firm. Athens must look inward, rebuild its strength, focus not on marble but on men. On families. On the lives of those who toil to keep this city standing. Applause erupted from one side of the Knicks, while others jeered, shaking their fists and shouting in defiance. The orator stepped back, his expression proud, and another man took his place. This one was younger, with a sharp jawline and eyes like flint. He waited for the crowd to quiet before he spoke. You call for retreat, he began, his voice smooth and unwavering. You speak of Sparta as if it is not already at our gates. But I tell you this, the only thing that holds them back is not fear of our words, but fear of our strength. And that strength comes from what Pericles has built. The walls, the fleets, the unity that binds us. There was another murmur, softer this time, more tentative. Kallias watched as the young speaker's words rippled through the crowd, like stones cast into still water. He spoke with conviction, with passion, his hands moving in time with his voice. Kallias found himself leaning forward, caught up in the rhythm of it. Athens is not merely stone and mortar, the speaker continued. It is an idea. A promise. A beacon of light in a world shrouded in darkness. To abandon that promise now, to retreat from our destiny, that would be the true tragedy. The applause was louder this time, swelling like a wave. Kallias felt his heart quicken, the words swirling in his mind. An idea. A promise. Could it be true? Could Athens truly be something more than just marble columns and cobbled streets? Lysias leaned closer, his voice low. Do you see now? How a voice can command a crowd. How words can bend thought and stir hearts. Kallias nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the platform where the young speaker stood, his head held high. I see it, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. They watched as more speakers took the stage, each one casting their vision for Athens. Some spoke of peace, of withdrawing from the wars that drained their coffers and stole their sons. Others called for expansion, for dominance, for Athens to rise as the unchallenged power of the Aegean. Each speech was met with cheers and jeers alike, the assembly a living beast, shifting and swaying with every word. But Kallias could not forget the young speaker, his voice sharp as a blade, his words cutting through the noise with precision. He had spoken of unity, of destiny. Of Athens as something greater. It lingered in Kallias's thoughts, like the echo of a drumbeat. The assembly began to break up as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the stone steps. Men drifted back toward the city, their voices raised in heated debate as they descended. Kallias stood still, his gaze lingering on the platform as if it still held the echoes of the voices that had spoken. Lysias placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "Come," he said, his voice softer now. "You've seen enough for today." Kallias nodded, though his feet were slow to follow. His mind swirled with ideas, with fragments of speeches and whispers of rebellion. He felt as if something had been lit inside him, a spark that crackled just beneath his skin. As they made their way back toward the agora, Kallias spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lysias, could someone like me, could I speak there one day?" Lysias smiled, his eyes warm with approval. "Athens belongs to those with the courage to stand," he replied. "If you have the will, Kallias, the Knicks will be waiting." Kallias looked back one last time at the stone platform, now bathed in shadow. The voices had faded, but their echoes lingered, threading through his thoughts like whispers on the wind. And in that moment, for the first time, he truly believed. The air was heavy with anticipation. The kind that sat on your chest and whispered of coming storms. Athens bustled as it always did, merchants haggled in the agora, children darted between sun-bleached columns, and the scent of grilled lamb and fresh olives wafted through the narrow streets. But beneath the surface, there was tension, like the taut string of a lyre, waiting for a single note to snap it. Kallias moved through the throngs of people, his steps purposeful as he made his way to the agora. Since that day on the Knicks, his thoughts had been consumed with what he'd seen and heard. The speeches, the passion, the power of words to sway hearts and sharpen resolve. Lysias had been right, Athens wasn't just marble and stone, it was an idea, a living, breathing promise. One that could be shaped by those with the courage to stand. He reached the edge of the agora, where the stalls were packed tight with vendors shouting prices for fish, spices, and woven cloth. Kallias ignored the calls, weaving his way toward the olive tree where Lysias usually held court. Today, the old philosopher was already there, seated on a stone bench with a small crowd gathered around him. Lysias looked up as Kallias approached, his eyes brightening with recognition. "Ah, my young friend," he greeted, gesturing for Kallias to join him. "I was just speaking of the cost of power. Come, listen." Kallias slipped into the edge of the circle, nodding to the others who had gathered, students, merchants, a soldier still dusted with the grime of the road. Lysias leaned forward, his voice carrying with the practiced ease of a seasoned orator. "Athens stands as a beacon of democracy," he began, his hands gesturing gracefully with each word. "But every beacon casts a shadow. We call ourselves free, yet we depend on the labor of those without voices. We call ourselves just, yet we send our sons to die for land and tribute." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kallias watched the expressions of those around him, some nodding, some frowning. Lysias did not pause. "And now," he continued, "we hear whispers of Sparta's movements to the south. Whispers of war. Do we, the people of Athens, truly understand the price that is being asked of us?" A young man near the front scoffed, arms crossed over his chest. "War is the cost of greatness," he shot back. "Sparta would have us kneel if we falter." Lysias smiled gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And yet, who pays that cost, my friend? The soldiers? The farmers? Or those who build their marble homes atop the bones of the fallen?" The young man flushed, his mouth snapping shut. Kallias watched with rapt attention as Lysias continued, his voice steady, unwavering. To be great is a noble thing, Lysias said. But to be just is a far greater one. And I wonder, my friends, if Athens remembers which it should be. There was silence then, the kind that presses against the ribs and steals breath. Kallias found his hands clenched at his sides, his mind whirling with questions. He had always been told that Athens was the pinnacle of civilization, a shining example of freedom and strength. But Lysias' words clung to him, unraveling the threads of that certainty. Lysias turned to Kallias, his gaze sharp and knowing. "Tell me, Kallias," he asked, his voice soft but carrying, "what do you think makes a city great?" Kallias hesitated, his heart hammering in his chest. He felt the eyes of the crowd turn toward him, their gazes heavy with expectation. His throat went dry, but he swallowed hard and forced the words out. "It's people," he said, the answer spilling out before he could second-guess it. "The people make it great." A flicker of surprise crossed Lysias' face, followed by a slow nod of approval. "Indeed," he replied. "The people. And what happens when the people are ignored? When their voices are drowned out by the clash of shields and the promise of glory?" Kallias swallowed, his mind racing. "Then, it's no longer Athens," he said, his voice steadier now. "It's just another city." Lysias' smile returned, broader this time. "You understand more than you think, young one," he said, resting a hand on Kallias' shoulder. "Remember that. When the time comes to choose." The crowd began to disperse, some nodding to themselves, others whispering quietly. Kallias stayed rooted in place, his heart still pounding. Lysias stood slowly, stretching his back with a grimace. "Walk with me," he said to Kallias. They set off toward the edge of the agora, where the noise of the market faded into a distant hum. "I see the questions in your eyes," Lysias said, his voice low. "You wonder why I speak so plainly of such things." Kallias nodded, his gaze fixed on the cobblestones beneath his feet. "Aren't you afraid? What if someone hears? What if they try to stop you?" Lysias chuckled, the sound dry and knowing. "They have tried, many times," he said. "Words are dangerous things. But they are also the only weapons I possess. And I will wield them until my tongue stills." Kallias felt the weight of those words, the gravity of them. "What about war?" he asked. "If Sparta comes, if they march on Athens, what happens then?" Lysias' smile faded, replaced by something harder, sharper. "Then we fight," he replied simply. "But I would have us fight for more than pride. I would have us fight for the people, for the promise of what Athens could be, not just what it has been." They walked in silence for a while, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. Kallias' thoughts churned, full of questions and doubts. He wanted to believe Lysias, wanted to believe that Athens could be more than stone and politics, more than war and glory. But the whispers of Sparta lingered, like a shadow stretching across the horizon. Finally, Lysias stopped, placing a firm hand on Kallias' shoulder. "Athens is at a crossroads," he said, his eyes locked on Kallias's. "And the choice we make will shape its future. You may not see it yet, but I do. The storm is coming. And when it does, Athens will need voices like yours." Kallias stared back, his heart pounding, the weight of those words settling heavy on his chest. He did not know if he was ready, did not know if he had the strength or the voice to be what Lysias seemed to see in him. But he nodded, his resolve hardening like stone. "Then I will be ready," he replied, his voice steady. Lysias smiled, clapping him on the back. "Good," he said. "Because I fear the storm is closer than we think." The news came like a winter wind, sharp, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. Spartan forces had crossed the Isthmus of Corinth, their march deliberate and unrelenting. Word spread quickly through the agora, whispered in hushed tones over bread stalls and muttered under breaths in shadowed alleys. For years, the threat of Spartan aggression had lingered on the edges of Athenian consciousness, a distant thundercloud that rumbled but never struck. Now, it had arrived. Kallias stood among the crowd that gathered near the steps of the temple of Hephaestus, his heart hammering in his chest. A soldier, his armor still dusted with the grime of the road, stood atop the marble steps, his voice raised above the clamor of the market. "Sparta advances," he announced, his voice clear and unwavering. "Their forces crossed the isthmus 2 days ago. They march with phalanx tight and shields shining. They bring with them not just soldiers, but siege weapons. We must prepare." The murmur of fear spread through the crowd, like ripples across a pond. Kallias felt the tension coil in his stomach. He looked to his right, where Thera stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes sharp and unblinking. "They're really coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising din. I didn't think they'd actually do it." Kallias swallowed hard. "Neither did I." The soldier continued, his voice unwavering. "The assembly meets tomorrow at dawn. All citizens are called to vote on our course of action. Athens stands at the threshold. We must choose whether to meet them in the field, or fortify our walls and prepare for siege." A shout erupted from the back of the crowd, the voice rough and strained. "And what of Pericles? What does he say?" The soldier hesitated, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Pericles calls for unity," he replied finally. "He believes Athens is strong enough to withstand the Spartan tide. But the decision rests with the people." A ripple of disbelief spread through the assembly. Some nodded in agreement, faces set with determination. Others shook their heads, whispering of folly and arrogance. Kallias felt the weight of it pressing down on him, the realization that for the first time in his life, the city might truly be in danger. Lysias found him among the crowd, his hand resting firmly on Kallias's shoulder. "Walk with me," the philosopher said, his voice low but urgent. They wove through the throngs of people, slipping into the shade of a colonnade that ran along the edge of the agora. Lysias' expression was grim, his eyes dark with thought. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kallias nodded slowly. "War," he replied. "Real war. Not just whispers or skirmishes." Lysias' eyes sharpened, his gaze piercing. "Yes. And war changes everything. Even here, even in Athens." He paused, his hand tightening on Kallias's shoulder. "The assembly will vote, but I fear the decision has already been made." Kallias frowned. "You mean Pericles?" Lysias nodded. "He has swayed the hearts of many. His promise of glory and Athenian strength, it blinds them to the reality of Sparta's strength. They will vote for war, Kallias. Mark my words. The weight of it settled on Kallias's shoulders, heavy and unyielding. He had grown up with stories of Spartan warriors, shadows on the horizon, whispers of impossible strength and unyielding discipline. But stories were just stories, distant and unthreatening. This was real. Is it true? Kallias asked, his voice uncertain. That they're as strong as they say? Lysias' gaze grew distant, his eyes clouding with memory. They are more than that, he replied. Sparta is not like Athens. They do not debate, they do not ponder. They train. From the moment they can walk, they are taught to fight, to endure, to kill. Their entire society is built for war. Kallias felt the chill of those words settle in his bones. And we're just going to fight them? Just like that? Lysias sighed, his hand slipping from Kallias's shoulder. It seems so. But war is not just fought on the field. It is fought here. He tapped his temple, and here, he placed his hand over his heart. Athens may not have Spartan iron, but it has something greater. It has spirit. And that is not so easily broken. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Kallias wanted to believe him, to believe that Athens could withstand the Spartan tide. But the whispers of the agora told a different story, one of fear and doubt, of heavy shields and iron discipline. Will you be there tomorrow? Kallias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lysias smiled, the lines on his face deepening with age and wisdom. Of course, he replied. I would not miss it. And neither should you. Kallias nodded, his resolve hardening. I'll be there. Lysias clapped him on the back, his grin turning wry. Good. Because the world changes tomorrow, my young friend. And we must be ready. They parted ways as the sun began its slow descent behind the Acropolis, casting long shadows across the city. Kallias walked alone through the agora, his mind buzzing with thoughts of war, of Spartan spears and Athenian pride. The whispers grew louder, merchants and philosophers alike trading rumors like currency. As he made his way home, Kallias glanced back at the Acropolis, its marble columns stark against the evening sky. He wondered what it would look like under siege, what Athens would become under the weight of Spartan iron. But even as fear crept into his heart, something else stirred, something deeper, stronger. A whisper of possibility, of change, of standing for something greater than himself. Athens was his city, his home. And if war was coming, then he would be ready. The assembly was alive with tension. Rows upon rows of Athenian citizens crowded the Pnyx, their voices rising and falling like waves crashing against stone. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the stone platform where orators took turns addressing the masses. Kallias stood among them, shoulder to shoulder with merchants, farmers, and soldiers, the weight of decision heavy in the air. Lysias was by his side, his expression unyielding, eyes sharp and observant. Kallias could feel the energy pulsing through the crowd, the anticipation, the fear, the resolve. This was the heartbeat of Athens, the pulse of its democracy. And today, that pulse was quickened with the specter of war. A voice boomed from the stage, cutting through the murmur of conversation. It was Pericles himself, robed in white, his posture regal and commanding. The crowd hushed almost instantly, eyes turning to him with reverence and expectation. "Citizens of Athens," Pericles began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the stone amphitheater. "We stand at a precipice. The shadow of Sparta looms large upon our borders. Their warriors march not with the intent of peace, but with the iron hand of conquest. We must not falter. We must not bow." A roar of approval surged through the crowd, men raising their fists and shouting agreement. Kallias felt the swell of emotion rise in his chest, the pull of unity that Pericles' words commanded. This was more than a speech, it was a call to arms, a rallying cry for the city to stand firm. Pericles continued, his voice unwavering. "We have built walls that cannot be breached, assembled fleets that command the seas, and fostered alliances that will see us through this storm. Athens is not just a city. It is an idea. An idea that men can rule themselves, that voices can be heard, that freedom is not a privilege, but a right." The crowd erupted again, louder this time. Kallias found himself shouting alongside them, his fists clenched, his heart pounding. He caught Lysias' gaze, expecting approval, but the old philosopher's face was pinched with concern. Kallias leaned closer, his voice low. "Don't you believe him?" Lysias' eyes flickered to the stage, where Pericles stood like a marble statue come to life. "I believe his words are powerful," Lysias replied. "But power without wisdom is a blade without a hilt. It cuts, yes, but who does it cut?" Kallias frowned, but before he could respond, another voice rose from the platform. This time, it was Cleon, a merchant turned politician, his frame thick and imposing. He took the stage with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. "If we are to survive, we must not only defend," Cleon bellowed, his voice rough and jagged compared to Pericles' smooth eloquence. "We must strike. We must carry the war to Sparta's doorstep. Let them taste the fire they would bring upon us." A ripple of excitement and fear coursed through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others murmured uneasily. Kallias felt the tension coil tighter, the choice looming heavy over their heads. Lysias scoffed under his breath. "Fools," he whispered. "Sparta is not a beast to be provoked. It is a mountain. You do not strike at a mountain, you endure it." Kallias looked at him sharply. "And do nothing? Let them come to us and take what they want?" Lysias smiled, but it was a sad, thin smile. "I did not say nothing," he replied. "I said endure. Sometimes strength is measured not in the blow you deliver, but in the one you can withstand." Kallias' mind swirled with conflicting thoughts, the words of Pericles and Cleon echoing alongside Lysias. He watched as the assembly broke into factions, men shouting over one another, fists raised, voices raw with passion. "Shouldn't we do something?" Kallias pressed. "If they're marching on us, shouldn't we fight back?" Lysias regarded him carefully. "Tell me, Kallias," he said, his voice softening, "why do you want to fight?" Kallias blinked, the question catching him off guard. Because it's our home," he replied, the words stumbling out. "We have to protect it." Lysias nodded slowly. "Yes. But is war the only way? Is glory worth the blood that spills upon these stones?" He gestured to the ground beneath their feet, to the marble steps of the Knicks now stained with dust and sweat. "Pericles speaks of glory, of legacy. But legacy is paid for with lives. And once spent, that currency does not return. Kallias felt the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. He glanced back toward the stage, where Pericles and Cleon continued their debate, their voices rising and falling like tides. Around them, men shouted and cheered, faces alight with fury and fear. Finally, a call rang out, a call for the vote. The assembly hushed, the weight of the decision pressing down on them like a hand against their throats. Kallias watched as men stepped forward, casting their ballots into bronze urns. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as each vote clanged against the metal, a chorus of fate ringing out across the necks. Lysias placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "Come," he said. "The decision has been made. Now we must prepare." Kallias followed him away from the platform, his mind heavy with the echoes of war. He glanced back once more, catching a final glimpse of Pericles, his face stern and unyielding as the crowd dispersed. "Do you think we chose right?" Kallias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lysias' gaze was distant, his eyes clouded with thoughts that reached beyond the agora, beyond the Knicks, beyond Athens itself. "Time will tell," he replied. "But remember this, Kallias, the flames of war burn not only the enemy, but the ones who light them." The words lingered, settling into Kallias's heart like stones. He looked back at the assembly, now a sea of departing figures, each one carrying with them the weight of the decision they had made. A decision that would shape the fate of Athens. And Kallias, caught between the tides of war and wisdom, knew there was no turning back. The days that followed the assembly's decision were a blur of motion and noise. The agora thrummed with new energy, blacksmiths hammering out spearheads and shields, leatherworkers crafting bindings for armor, and merchants hawking sacks of grain and dried meat for the coming siege. Athens was changing, reshaping itself for war. Kallias moved through the chaos with a sense of urgency. Lysias had tasked him with small errands, fetching scrolls from the library, delivering messages to the orators who would speak at the next assembly. It felt important, vital even, though Kallias knew it was just a fragment of the larger storm brewing around them. He passed soldiers drilling in the open squares, their shields clashing in rhythm, the sound echoing off stone walls like the beat of a drum. Their faces were stern, eyes sharp with focus. Many were young, some even younger than Kallias, and they moved with the raw energy of those who had yet to taste real battle. Kallias watched them, his mind drifting to thoughts of Spartan warriors, their iron discipline and unyielding formations. How would these boys fare against them? He swallowed hard and pressed on. At Lysias' request, he found himself at the home of Cleon, the politician who had called for aggression at the assembly. His estate was grand, its walls adorned with frescoes of past battles and victories, the marble pillars glimmering in the sunlight. Kallias hesitated at the gate, his fingers curling into fists at his sides before a servant finally led him inside. Cleon sat at a low table, poring over maps of the Peloponnese, his thick fingers tracing lines and borders. He looked up as Kallias approached, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You are Lysias, runner?" Cleon asked, his voice rough and direct. Kallias nodded, forcing his shoulders back. "I am." Cleon gestured to the seat opposite him. "Sit. You bring news from the agora?" Kallias settled into the chair, his back straight. "Lysias wanted me to inform you that the merchants have agreed to his terms. They will fund the supplies for the fleet, provided their trade routes remain protected during the conflict. Cleon grunted, nodding with satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Trade must not falter. If Athens is to stand against Sparta, we must keep our coffers full and our people fed." He leaned back, his gaze studying Kallias with surprising intensity. "And what does Lysias think of all this? Does the old philosopher still believe words are sharper than swords?" Kallias hesitated. He had seen Lysias debate in the agora, watched him sway crowds with mere words. But war was different, war was iron and blood. "He believes that Athens must be strong," Kallias replied carefully, "but he also believes strength is not just found in battle." Cleon laughed, the sound rich and booming. "Spoken like a true dreamer," he said, shaking his head. "Strength is exactly that, battle. War is the forge upon which empires are shaped. Athens will not endure on words alone, boy. It endures by force. By dominance." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Remember that." Kallias nodded, though his heart clenched at the words. Cleon's conviction was undeniable, his certainty like a fire that burned away all doubt. But something in Kallias resisted, a whisper of dissent that he could not quite shake. "Tell Lysias I appreciate his efforts," Cleon continued, waving a hand dismissively. "But when it comes to war, philosophy has no place. Only strength does." Kallias stood, bowing his head politely before turning to leave. His thoughts were tangled, his steps heavy as he made his way back to the agora. The streets were busier now, thrumming with preparation and whispers of Spartan advances. He heard men speaking of fortified walls, of naval defenses, of the glory that awaited Athens in the clash of shields and spears. He found Lysias seated beneath the olive tree where they had first spoken. The old man looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than Kallias remembered. "Did you deliver the message?" Lysias asked, his voice low. Kallias nodded, settling down beside him. "I did. Cleon is confident," he said carefully. Lysias chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Cleon is always confident. It is his greatest strength, and his greatest weakness." Kallias leaned back against the trunk of the tree, the bark rough against his skin. "Do you think he's right? That strength is all that matters?" Lysias was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the bustling market before them. "Strength matters," he said finally. "But strength of character matters more. Athens is great not because of its armies, but because of its ideas. Its spirit. If we lose that, we lose everything." Kallias nodded, though the weight of the decision pressed down on him like a stone. He could feel it shifting in the air, the scent of war creeping in with the dust and the heat. It was coming, inevitable and unyielding, and Athens would be swept up in its grasp. "And what of Sparta?" Kallias asked, his voice softer now. "How can we stand against them if they're as strong as everyone says?" Lysias' eyes were hard, unyielding. "Sparta is strong, yes. But strength alone is not enough. It must be tempered with wisdom, with justice. If Athens remembers that, we may yet endure." Kallias wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that Athens could withstand the storm that was coming. But as he watched soldiers march through the agora, their shields polished and spears gleaming, doubt gnawed at him, whispering of iron and fire, of blood and ruin. Lysias placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. Fear not, my friend. The battle has not yet begun. And if I know anything of Athens, it is that its spirit cannot be broken so easily. Kallias managed a small smile, though it felt hollow. I hope you're right. Lysias' gaze hardened, his eyes shining with defiance. Hope, he said firmly, is the one thing Sparta cannot take from us. And so they sat in silence beneath the olive tree, the city around them humming with the echoes of war. Kallias stared out over the agora, his heart heavy with uncertainty but laced with a thread of hope, fragile and stubborn. Because Athens was not just stone and marble, it was an idea. And ideas, Kallias prayed, were harder to kill than men. The morning broke with a grim stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. From the top of the Acropolis, Kallias could see the expanse of Athens stretching outward, homes clustered together, the agora bustling with hurried movement, and the towering city walls looming like silent guardians. Lysias had sent him to gather supplies, instructing him to meet Thera by the southern gate. The journey through the city was slow, hindered by carts loaded with grain, barrels of water, and families trying to secure their belongings. Tension pressed down on everyone like the weight of an unspoken truth. As Kallias approached the southern gate, he spotted Thera wrestling with a stubborn mule tied to a cart laden with amphorae. She looked up, wiping sweat from her forehead, and gave a tired smile. "Stubborn beast," she muttered, tugging at the reins. Kallias approached, taking hold of the mule's harness. "Need help?" She rolled her eyes. "You always show up when the work's almost done. Convenient." He smirked, guiding the mule forward. "You just don't know how to charm a mule. Watch." He whispered softly to the animal, stroking its neck, and the mule snorted but moved. Thera raised an eyebrow. "Maybe I should keep you around for more than just lifting crates." As they made their way toward the gate, Kallias lowered his voice. "Lysias says the Spartans are closer than the assembly admits. Scouts saw their vanguard less than 2 days' march from the city." Thera's face tightened, her playful demeanor vanishing. "How long do we have?" "A few days, at most," Kallias replied. "Pericles ordered the gates sealed tonight. No one in or out." Thera glanced back at the agora, where vendors were still shouting prices, some desperately trying to sell off their remaining goods. "Do they know?" Kallias shook his head. "Not yet. Pericles wants to keep panic at bay. But when those gates close..." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "People will know." They made their way to the storeroom where Lysias was overseeing the distribution of supplies. The old philosopher was directing a group of younger men, instructing them to stack amphorae in the shaded corners to keep them cool. When he saw Kallias and Thera approach, his face softened. "Good. You're here," Lysias said. "We need to secure the grain and wine for the militia. The last thing we need is spoiled rations." Thera set her load down, wiping her hands on her tunic. "Have you heard more from the scouts?" Lysias glanced around, ensuring no one else was listening. "Yes. They've confirmed the Spartans are marching in full force, infantry, cavalry, and siege engines. They're not coming for skirmishes. They're coming to break us." A chill ran through Kallias, but he steadied himself, focusing on the task at hand. "What about the navy? Can't we strike their flanks while they march?" Lysias shook his head. Pericles wants the fleet kept near the coast to protect our supply lines. If Sparta cuts off our access to the sea, we're as good as starved. The weight of the situation settled over them. Lysias turned to Thera. You've been helping organize the medics, yes? She nodded. Bandages, salves, herbs, we've got what we can. But if the fighting reaches the city itself... Lysias' face grew grim. Let us hope it does not come to that. Suddenly, the distant sound of a horn echoed from the walls, a long, mournful blast that seemed to vibrate through the city itself. Kallias felt the hair on his arms rise. That's the call, Thera whispered, her face pale. They've closed the gates. A murmur spread through the agora, people turning to look toward the city walls. The realization dawned slowly, a creeping dread that settled like dust. Kallias felt his stomach twist. Athens was now a fortress, sealed off from the world. Lysias moved to the doorway, looking out toward the southern gate. It's begun, he said quietly. Kallias followed his gaze, watching as soldiers moved to reinforce the barricades. He knew what it meant: no one in, no one out. Whatever fate awaited Athens would be faced together, within these walls. Will they try to breach the walls? Thera asked, her voice hushed. Lysias nodded. They'll try. But Sparta doesn't favor long sieges. They'll want to break our spirit quickly. If we can hold them off, force them to waste their strength, we might survive. Kallias looked back at the city, the streets now crowded with anxious faces. How long can we last? Lysias' gaze was hard, unyielding. Long enough to make them reconsider. We have the walls, the fleet, and the spirit of Athens. But it will not be easy. Kallias wanted to believe him. Wanted to trust that the city he loved could withstand the might of Sparta. But the horn's mournful echo still vibrated in his bones, reminding him that hope alone would not be enough. As night fell, the streets became quieter, the bustling energy replaced by hushed conversations and flickering lanterns. Kallias sat on the steps of the storeroom, his thoughts racing. Thera joined him, leaning back against the stone wall. Scared? She asked, her voice softer than usual. He nodded. A little. She gave a small, crooked smile. Good. Means you're not stupid. He laughed, the sound surprising him. It broke the tension, just for a moment. And you? Thera looked out toward the darkened streets. I'm more worried about the people. War isn't just about who wins. It's about who survives. Kallias watched her profile, the firelight from the lantern casting shadows on her face. We'll survive, he said, more to convince himself than her. She turned to him, her eyes serious. Only if we remember what we're fighting for. Not just to beat Sparta, but to protect what makes us, us. He nodded, feeling that strange mix of fear and determination. Athens had always been more than just walls and politics. It was the people, the ideas, the stubborn refusal to bow to anyone. Promise me something, Thera said, her voice barely above a whisper. What? That when the time comes, you'll stand. Not just for Athens, but for yourself. For what you believe. Kallias looked at her, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. I promise. They sat in silence, listening to the city as it braced itself for the storm. Kallias felt the resolve harden in his chest, the fear settling into something sharper, something like courage. The siege had begun. And now, all they could do was endure. The morning sun crept over the walls of Athens, its light stretching across the stone battlements and narrow streets, casting long shadows over the city. Kallias stood atop the western wall, his hands gripping the rough edge of the parapet. The air was still, heavy with anticipation and the scent of dust and sweat. Below him, Athenian soldiers bustled with preparation, organizing spears, stacking shields, and whispering hurried prayers to Athena. Kallias's heart thudded in his chest, each beat a reminder that this was not a dream. Sparta was coming. Their forces had been sighted at dawn, their banners unfurled, the red of their cloaks stark against the dusty horizon. He had never seen them before, not like this. He had heard stories, of course, tales of iron discipline and unyielding strength. But now they were real, marching with the precision of 1,000 iron blades. Lysias joined him at the wall, his expression grim. "They move like shadows," the old philosopher murmured, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Efficient, precise, like they were born with swords in their hands." Kallias swallowed hard. "Can we hold them?" Lysias turned to him, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "We have to," he replied. "Athens must not fall. Not now. Not to them." Below, the city stirred to life with the sounds of preparation. Women hauled barrels of water to strategic points, children scurried between buildings carrying messages, and men, some barely older than Kallias, strapped on armor with hands that shook only slightly. The air was electric, thick with the kind of tension that spoke of coming violence. Thera appeared beside them, her eyes scanning the horizon. She was dressed in simple leather armor, a dagger strapped to her hip. Kallias looked at her in surprise. "You're fighting?" She raised an eyebrow. "You think I'm going to sit in some basement while you lot get all the glory?" Her grin was sharp, edged with steel. "Not a chance." Kallias smiled despite himself. "You don't even like glory." Thera shrugged. "I like surviving. If that means fighting, so be it." A blast of horns shattered the morning stillness. Kallias's heart lurched in his chest, and all eyes turned to the horizon. Dust plumed upward like smoke, heralding the arrival of the Spartan phalanx. They moved with the precision of a single entity, shields locked, spears held high. Their crimson cloaks billowed behind them, catching the light as they marched forward with the slow inevitability of a rising tide. Lysias drew a slow, measured breath. "There they are," he murmured. "The wolves of Sparta." Kallias felt his pulse quicken, fear threading through his veins. They're like machines," he whispered. Lysias nodded. "That is their strength. But it is also their weakness. Machines do not bend, they break." The Spartan line halted just beyond the range of the archers, their shields gleaming under the sunlight. A lone figure stepped forward from their ranks, his armor polished to a mirror sheen, the crest of his helmet bristling with black horsehair. His voice rang out across the plain, deep and resonant. "Athens," the Spartan called, his voice clear and unyielding. "We have come to claim what is ours. Open your gates and submit. There need not be blood today." A murmur spread through the Athenian ranks, whispers of fear and uncertainty. Kallias glanced at Lysias, whose jaw was set, his eyes hard. "What do we do?" Kallias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lysias' gaze did not waver from the Spartan commander. "We hold," he replied firmly. "We do not surrender. Not today. Not ever." Another blast of horns erupted from the walls of Athens, this time a challenge. A cry of defiance. Kallias watched as Athenian archers took their positions, bows strung and arrows nocked. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his own spear, the weight of it unfamiliar but solid. Thera nudged him with her elbow. "First time?" He nodded, the words caught in his throat. She smirked. "Just aim for the ones trying to kill you. Makes it simpler." Kallias managed a weak laugh, his grip tightening on the shaft of the spear. "Right. Simple." The Spartan commander raised his spear, the gesture mirrored instantly by the phalanx behind him. Their shields locked tighter, the sound like iron snapping into place. Kallias saw the glint of sunlight on spearheads, hundreds of them, angled forward like the teeth of a great beast. Athenian soldiers braced themselves along the wall, shields raised, faces set with grim determination. Kallias could feel the tension humming in the air, the collective breath of 1,000 men and women, waiting for the storm. The Spartan commander shouted something in Greek, and the phalanx began its march. It was slow, methodical, and relentless, the ground trembling beneath their weight. Kallias felt his heart slam against his ribs, his breath coming quicker now. He looked to Lysias, whose eyes remained fixed on the advancing army. "Now," Lysias whispered, almost to himself. "Now we see what Athens is made of." Kallias raised his spear, the muscles in his arm taut with tension. He glanced at Thera, who nodded once, her eyes fierce and unyielding. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," Kallias replied, though his voice wavered. The Spartan march continued, the space between them shrinking with each steady step. The archers along the wall tensed, awaiting the order. Kallias felt his breath catch, his knuckles widening against the spear's shaft. "Steady," Lysias murmured, his hand on Kallias's shoulder. The Spartans came closer, their shields gleaming, their steps unbroken. Kallias could see their faces now, hard and expressionless, eyes fixed forward. There was no fear in their gaze, only purpose. "Now," the captain shouted from the parapet. "Archers, fire!" A flurry of arrows darkened the sky, arcing downward in a deadly rain. Kallias watched as the Spartans raised their shields in perfect unison, the iron-tipped hail clattering harmlessly against their defense. Only a handful fell, their bodies collapsing silently to the dust. The phalanx did not break stride. It moved closer, relentless, unstoppable. "Brace yourselves," the captain shouted. Kallias swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Spartan war machine pressed on, closer now, the dust rising around them like smoke. Beside him, Thera gripped her spear tighter, her eyes never leaving the approaching wall of shields. "Remember what you promised me," she whispered. Kallias nodded, his resolve hardening. "I remember." The Spartans drew nearer, the sound of their march like distant thunder. Kallias raised his spear, his breath steadying, his hands firm. Athens would hold. It had to. The sound of iron crashing against iron filled the air, a cacophony of war that drowned out all other noise. Kallias stood shoulder to shoulder with the other Athenian soldiers, his spear held tightly in his hands, the wood slick with sweat. From his vantage point atop the walls, he could see the Spartan phalanx closing in, their shields interlocked, their spears thrust forward like a wall of teeth. The first wave hit the walls with the force of a thunderclap. Spartan soldiers crashed against the stone, their shields battering the gates and walls with unrelenting rhythm. Athenian archers fired from above, their arrows raining down in desperate volleys. Some found their mark, slipping between shields or striking unprotected flesh, but many more clattered uselessly against bronze and iron. Kallias's heart pounded as he watched the Spartans press forward, their movements methodical and unyielding. He could see their faces now, hard and expressionless, eyes fixed with deadly focus. These were not men of hesitation or fear, they moved as if war was their native tongue, as if the rhythm of battle was the only song they had ever known. "Ready yourselves," shouted the captain from the parapet, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold the line." Kallias gripped his spear tighter, the muscles in his arms taut and shaking. Beside him, Thera's gaze was locked on the enemy, her jaw set with grim determination. She met his eyes for a moment, her expression fierce. "Don't you dare flinch," she spat, her voice sharp. "Not now." Kallias nodded, forcing the fear down into his gut where it simmered, controlled but still present. He could feel the vibrations of the siege engines as Spartan catapults launched massive stones against the walls. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and dust rained from the stonework above. The Spartans pushed forward, their shields clashing against the barricades with measured force. Athenian soldiers stabbed down with long spears, catching the tops of helmets or slipping between shield gaps, but the Spartans never wavered. When one fell, another stepped forward, shields locking back into place with mechanical precision. "They don't stop," Kallias whispered, his breath ragged. Lysias appeared beside him, his expression grim but resolute. "That is their strength," he replied. "But it is also their flaw. They do not adapt. If we hold, if we endure, they will break before we do." Kallias wanted to believe him, but the sight of the relentless Spartan advance made it difficult. The phalanx moved like a tide, slow but unstoppable, crashing against the walls in unyielding waves. "Here they come!" Thera shouted, her voice sharp and clear. Kallias followed her gaze and saw it, a breach. The southern barricade had splintered under the weight of Spartan battering rams, the wood cracking and splintering like dry kindling. Spartan soldiers poured through the gap, shields raised, spears angled forward. Panic flickered through the Athenian line. Some men stepped back, their courage faltering, but the captains shouted for them to hold, to stand their ground. Kallias felt the urge to run clawing at his legs, but he forced himself to stay, his hands white-knuckled around his spear. "Hold!" Lysias bellowed, his voice louder than Kallias had ever heard it. "Athens does not retreat." The words lit a fire in Kallias's chest. He looked to Thera, who stood unyielding, her spear raised, eyes blazing. She met his gaze and nodded once. "For Athens," she whispered. Kallias felt the strength return to his limbs, the fear hardening into something sharper, resolve. "For Athens," he repeated. The Spartans surged through the breach, their shields raised, their spears stabbing forward. Kallias watched as the first wave crashed into the Athenian line, the sound of metal on metal ringing out like a forge at work. He saw the face of the first Spartan who came for him, a young man, eyes hard and unyielding, spear angled at Kallias's chest. Kallias reacted instinctively, his spear coming up to parry the blow. The force of the impact rattled his bones, but he held firm, twisting the shaft and forcing the Spartan's weapon to the side. Before the soldier could recover, Kallias thrust forward, his spear tip finding the gap beneath the helmet. Blood spattered against the stone, and the Spartan crumpled. Kallias blinked, barely believing what he had done. His breath came in ragged bursts, adrenaline burning through his veins. But there was no time to think, no time to hesitate. Another Spartan stepped forward, and Kallias raised his spear again, his muscles moving as if possessed. Beside him, Thera fought with the same ferocity, her movements fluid and precise. She ducked beneath a spear thrust, her dagger flashing upward to catch her attacker under the arm. He staggered back, blood pooling at his side, and Thera stepped forward, finishing the job with ruthless efficiency. "Keep moving," she shouted, her eyes wild with battle fury. "We can't let them push us back." Kallias nodded, the fear in his gut replaced with something sharper. He lunged forward, his spear clashing against Spartan shields, his muscles burning with effort. Around him, Athenian soldiers fought with desperation, their movements less polished but no less determined. The clash at the breach became a melee, chaotic and brutal. Kallias felt the sting of iron against his skin, the burn of sweat in his eyes. He fought without thinking, his instincts driving him forward, his spear jabbing and slicing in quick, desperate arcs. For a moment, it seemed as if the Spartan line would break. Their phalanx wavered, men falling under the Athenian onslaught. Kallias shouted, the sound raw and guttural, and he saw others doing the same, their spirits lifted by the Spartan falter. But then, as if guided by some invisible hand, the Spartans regrouped. Their shields locked back into place, their line reformed, and the push began anew. Kallias watched in horror as they advanced, their movements smooth and unyielding, their faces devoid of fear. Thera grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "We have to fall back," she shouted over the din, "we can't hold this breach." Kallias shook his head, his breath coming in ragged bursts. But Athens. "Not like this," she yelled, her voice desperate. "We hold the wall, but not here. We can regroup. We can fight again." Kallias hesitated, his gaze flicking to Lysias, who was already pulling men back, shouting orders with surprising clarity. The philosopher met Kallias's eyes, nodding sharply. "Fall back. Regroup. Athens endures." Reluctantly, Kallias took a step back, his feet heavy with the weight of retreat. He saw Thera nodding at him, her expression hard but resolute. "This isn't over," she said, her voice fierce. "We fall back. We fight again." Kallias nodded, his grip tightening on his spear. "We fight again." The Athenian forces pulled back from the breach, their line reforming under the watchful eyes of captains and commanders. The Spartans did not pursue, content to hold their ground for now. But Kallias knew it was only the beginning. The clash at the gates had left its mark, iron and blood spilled on Athenian soil. And Kallias, with sweat dripping from his brow and blood on his hands, understood what came next. War was here. And it had only just begun. The days that followed the clash at the gates settled into a grim rhythm. The Spartans encircled the city like wolves, their camp stretching across the plains beyond Athens' walls, fires flickering in the night like watchful eyes. From the ramparts, Kallias could see the Spartan phalanxes drilling with relentless precision, their shields glinting under the harsh sunlight, their discipline unyielding. Athens had become a fortress. The gates were barred, the walls fortified with sharpened stakes, and every able-bodied man had been conscripted for defense. Kallias had seen men who once sold fish in the agora now armed with spears, their hands calloused not from trade but from the grip of iron. It was surreal, watching the city shift from philosophy and debate to the harsh realities of survival. The siege engines arrived on the third day. Massive constructs of wood and iron, pulled by teams of oxen, their frames creaking and groaning with each movement. Kallias watched from the walls as the Spartans assembled them with the precision of craftsmen, beams and pulleys clicking into place like pieces of a giant puzzle. Beside him, Lysias observed with a grim expression. "They mean to break the walls," he murmured, his voice low. Kallias glanced at him. "Can they?" Lysias sighed. "Given time, any wall can be broken. The question is, will they outlast our will?" Kallias swallowed hard, his gaze drifting back to the Spartan lines. "And will they?" Lysias did not answer, but his silence was more telling than words. Kallias gripped the stone of the parapet, his knuckles white. Below, women and children moved hurriedly through the streets, carrying water, stacking supplies, preparing for the long haul. He could see Thera among them, directing the younger ones with sharp gestures, her voice rising over the clamor. Despite the strain, there was an unyielding spirit in the city. Athens would not fall easily. Not while there were still hands to fight and voices to shout defiance. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the city, Kallias descended from the walls and made his way through the bustling streets. The markets had been repurposed, stalls once filled with fruit and fish now carried stacks of arrows, barrels of pitch, and bundles of spears. Blacksmiths worked late into the night, their hammers ringing out in steady, rhythmic beats. He found Thera near the southern gate, organizing a line of women passing buckets of water hand to hand. Her hair was tied back, strands of it plastered to her forehead with sweat. She looked up as he approached, offering him a tired smile. "Decided to join the real work," she teased, hefting a bucket into his hands. Kallias accepted it, falling into line. "Thought I'd see what all the fuss is about," he replied, his tone light despite the weight pressing on his shoulders. She snorted, wiping her brow. "It's about survival," she said, her voice lowering. "We're going to need every drop." Kallias nodded, passing the bucket down the line. He glanced back toward the walls, the distant siege engines now silhouetted against the twilight sky. "Do you think we can hold?" Thera's hands stilled for a moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "We have to," she said simply. "We're Athenians. This city, it's more than just stone and marble. It's everything we are." Kallias looked at her, the fire in her eyes burning brighter than any torch. "You really believe that?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "I do. And so should you." Before he could reply, a shout rang out from the walls, sharp and sudden. Kallias's heart lurched. Thera dropped her bucket and grabbed his arm. "Come on," she urged. "Something's happening." They ran through the narrow streets, dodging carts and barrels, following the sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps. The walls came into view, lined with soldiers and citizens alike, their faces tense and alert. Kallias and Thera pushed their way through the crowd, reaching the edge of the battlements. The sight before them was enough to steal the breath from Kallias's lungs. The Spartans had lit their engines. Great towers of wood, reinforced with iron, rolled forward on massive wheels, their frames covered in dampened hides to prevent fire. Behind them, lines of infantry marched, their shields raised, their spears gleaming in the dim light. A massive battering ram swung from chains beneath one of the towers, its head crowned with iron fashioned into the likeness of a bull. It crashed against the ground as it rolled, the thud reverberating through the stone beneath Kallias's feet. "Gods!" Thera whispered, her eyes wide. "They mean to break us tonight." Kallias swallowed, his throat dry. "We have to stop them." Thera glanced at him, her eyes fierce. "Then let's not waste time talking about it." Together, they descended from the walls, joining the others as they rushed to reinforce the barricades. Kallias hefted crates of pitch and oil, his muscles burning with the effort. The smell of sweat and fear mingled in the air, heavy and cloying. Lysias appeared at the southern barricade, his expression taut. "They're coming for the gates first," he shouted to the soldiers nearby. "We have to hold them there. If the gate falls, the city falls." Kallias met his eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. He moved to Lysias' side, grabbing a spear from the stack and testing its weight. Lysias nodded approvingly. "Keep your stance wide," the philosopher murmured. "Balance is everything." Kallias smirked despite the tension. "You're teaching me to fight now?" Lysias raised an eyebrow. "Philosophy is not just words. Sometimes, it is action. Stand tall, boy. Athens needs you." Kallias's grip tightened on the spear. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, heavy but not unwelcome. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. Lysias nodded. "Good. Because they're here." The Spartans crashed against the southern gate with the force of a tidal wave. Kallias braced himself, his feet digging into the dirt as the ram struck the iron-bound wood, splinters flying. The men around him shouted, their voices blending with the roar of impact. Kallias held his ground, the spear firm in his grasp. He looked to his left and saw Thera, her face set with determination, her own spear ready. She met his gaze and gave him a nod. "For Athens," she shouted above the noise. Kallias shouted back. "For Athens." And as the Spartans pressed harder, as the gate shuddered under the weight of iron and blood, Kallias felt something ignite in his chest. A fire that would not be extinguished. A defiance that would not be quelled. The siege had tightened, the city strained under the pressure. But Kallias stood firm, his spear in hand, his heart unyielding. Athens would not fall. Not today. The Spartan battering ram thundered against the southern gate, each strike sending splinters of wood flying through the air. Kallias felt each blow resonate through the stone beneath his feet, a deep, rhythmic pulse that rattled his bones. The men beside him held firm, their shields raised, their faces grim with determination. Above them, archers lined the walls, their bows drawn tight, waiting for the order. Lysias paced along the battlements, his eyes fixed on the enemy lines, calculating, planning. "Hold your fire," he called, his voice carrying above the din. "Wait for them to commit." Kallias watched the Spartan siege towers lurch forward, their massive wheels grinding over the uneven ground. The towers bristled with shields, their tops manned by soldiers clutching javelins and bows. He saw ladders being hoisted, ropes slung over shoulders, and his heart pounded with the realization that soon, those towers would reach the walls. Thera stood beside him, her knuckles white against the haft of her spear. "They're pushing hard," she muttered, her eyes never leaving the advancing army. Kallias nodded. "They mean to break us before dawn." "Then we don't let them," she replied, her voice steely with resolve. A sudden roar erupted from the Spartan lines, and the battering ram slammed against the gate with renewed force. The iron-bound wood groaned under the pressure, and Kallias heard the crack of timber splintering. A murmur of fear rippled through the Athenian defenders, but Lysias' voice rang out above the chaos. "Archers! Loose!" The command was followed by the sharp twang of bowstrings, and a rain of arrows arced through the sky, descending upon the Spartan ranks. Kallias watched as the arrows struck shields and armor, some finding flesh, others clattering harmlessly to the ground. The Spartans did not falter. They continued their relentless push, shield by shield, step by step. Lysias turned to Kallias and Thera. "The towers will reach us soon. When they do, we must be ready. Stay close, watch each other's backs." Kallias swallowed hard, nodding. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavy and suffocating. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a flicker of determination, a stubborn refusal to yield. He looked at Thera, who was staring straight ahead, her eyes hard with purpose. The first siege tower slammed into the wall with a crash that shook the stone. Ladders were flung outward, their hooks catching on the battlements. Spartan soldiers began to climb, their shields held tight to their bodies, their spears angled upward. "Get ready!" Lysias shouted, hefting a spear of his own. "This is where we hold." Kallias positioned himself behind the low wall, his spear angled downward, just as he had been taught. His hands shook, but he forced them to steady, focusing on the movements of the soldiers climbing toward him. Their faces were grim, eyes locked on the top of the wall as if nothing else existed. "Wait for it," Lysias muttered beside him. "Wait, now." Kallias lunged forward, his spear thrusting down between the rungs of the ladder. He felt the impact as it struck flesh, the resistance as the tip drove through armor. The Spartan soldier grunted, his grip faltering, and then he fell, tumbling backward into the line of men climbing below him. Again. Lysias barked. "Don't let them gain a foothold." Kallias stepped back, repositioned, and thrust again, his movements more confident, more sure. He caught another Spartan just beneath the arm, slipping through the gap in the bronze plating. The man fell silently, his body crashing into the others. Thera fought beside him, her movements fluid and fierce. She ducked under a spear thrust, slicing upward with her dagger to catch the soldier beneath the jaw. Blood sprayed across the stone, and she stepped back, her face set with grim focus. "We're holding," she shouted, a grin breaking across her face. Kallias couldn't help but smile back. For now. More ladders slammed against the walls, more soldiers climbing with unyielding determination. Kallias fought with everything he had, his muscles aching, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with dust and ash. But he did not falter. He could not. Athens depended on them. The walls had to hold. Suddenly, a shout went up from the southern gate. Kallias looked over his shoulder and saw cracked spiderwebbing across the heavy wooden beams. The battering ram crashed into it again, and this time, the gate splintered with a deafening crack. Lysias' face went pale. "They're breaking through," he shouted. "We need reinforcements." Kallias looked to Thera, whose expression mirrored his own fear. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Thera's eyes hardened. "We fight. Until there's nothing left to fight with." Kallias nodded, the fear coiling in his stomach turning to iron. "Then let's go." They pushed their way down from the battlements, weaving through the crowds of soldiers rushing to reinforce the gate. The noise was deafening, shouted orders, the clang of iron, the crash of stone. Kallias felt the walls tremble beneath him, dust shaking from the ceiling above. When they reached the gate, it was chaos. Athenian soldiers fought to hold the breach, their shields pressed together, their spears flashing in quick, desperate strikes. Spartans pushed against them, shields locked, their movements brutal and efficient. Kallias gripped his spear tighter. "We need to reinforce the line," he shouted over the din. Thera nodded, her face set with determination. "Then let's not waste time." Together, they plunged into the fray, their movements synchronized, their strikes calculated. Kallias thrust his spear forward, catching a Spartan beneath the helmet. The soldier fell, replaced immediately by another. Thera spun beside him, her dagger flashing in precise arcs. The noise, the chaos, the smell of blood and sweat, all of it faded into a singular focus. Survive. Hold the line. Protect Athens. Kallias didn't know how long they fought. Time blurred into a swirl of motion and pain. But when the horn sounded and the Spartans began to retreat, he could scarcely believe it. They had held. The gate had not fallen. He leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Thera slumped beside him, her face streaked with grime but alive. She looked at him and laughed, a tired, ragged sound that bordered on hysteria. "We held them," she whispered, disbelief thick in her voice. Kallias nodded, his eyes scanning the battlements where Athenian soldiers raised their weapons in triumph. "We did." But as the Spartan forces retreated, regrouping just beyond the range of their arrows, Kallias felt a chill settle over him. They had survived the first assault, but the siege had only just begun. The walls still stood. But for how long? The aftermath of the Spartan assault left Athens battered but unbroken. Smoke curled from the edges of the city walls where siege engines had left their mark. The southern gate, cracked but standing, bore the scars of Spartan iron, its wood splintered and blackened from pitch and flame. Soldiers milled about, some nursing wounds, others reinforcing barricades or hauling water to the battlements. Kallias sat slumped against the stone wall, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His hands were raw from gripping his spear, his arms heavy with exhaustion. Blood smeared his tunic, some of it his own, most of it not. He stared at his hands, shaking slightly, and forced them to still. Beside him, Thera slumped to the ground, her back against the stone, her chest heaving with exertion. Her hair was matted with sweat and dust, but her eyes still burned with fierce determination. "We did it," she murmured, almost to herself. "We held." Kallias looked at her, disbelief mingling with relief. "Barely," he replied, his voice raw. They'll be back. Thera nodded, her expression hardening. Of course they will. But we're still here. Lysias appeared from the shadows, his face pale but resolute. He surveyed the damage with a critical eye, pausing to speak quietly with some of the captains who passed. When he reached Kallias and Thera, he dropped heavily to the ground beside them. You fought well, Lysias said simply, his eyes flicking between them. Better than I expected. Thera smirked, wiping blood from her cheek. I don't remember you doing much fighting, she quipped. Lysias chuckled, though the sound was hollow. Someone had to keep the captains from running off, he replied. His gaze turned serious. The Spartans will not give up easily. This was only a test. Their real push is coming. Kallias felt a chill settle over him. And we barely survived the test, he murmured. Lysias nodded grimly. We have enough grain and water for a few weeks, perhaps a month if we ration. But morale is a fickle thing. If they break it, we're finished. Thera straightened, her eyes flashing. Then we don't let them break it. Lysias smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. I admire your spirit, he said quietly. But spirit alone won't hold these walls. We need a plan. Kallias looked out across the city, the rooftops stretching toward the walls, the sea of faces hardened by fear and determination. What kind of plan? Lysias leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. We fight them on our terms. Not theirs. Thera raised an eyebrow. How do you propose we do that? They outnumber us, they're stronger, and they don't break. Lysias' eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. Every man has a weakness, he said slowly. Even Spartans. We just need to find it. Kallias exchanged a glance with Thera, uncertainty flickering between them. And if we don't? Kallias asked. Lysias' gaze hardened. Then we hold. We hold until the last man, if need be. Because Athens does not fall. The days that followed were marked by a strange, tense silence. Spartan encampments dotted the plains outside the city walls, their fires flickering through the night like watchful eyes. Athens stood on edge, its people bracing for the inevitable clash that would decide their fate. Kallias patrolled the walls with Thera, his hands never far from the spear that had become an extension of himself. The Spartans had pulled back, but they were not idle. From the battlements, Kallias watched as siege engines were reinforced and trebuchets were positioned with ruthless precision. Wooden towers, covered in dampened hides to protect them from fire, edged closer each day, inching toward the walls as if taunting the defenders. We can't wait for them to come to us, Lysias said one evening, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He stood with Kallias and Thera atop the northern wall, the breeze tugging at his robes. If we wait for their machines to reach us, we'll be fighting uphill on every front. Kallias frowned. What are you suggesting? A sally? We don't have the numbers for that. Lysias' eyes gleamed. Not a full sally, he corrected. Something smaller. Targeted. We don't need to break their lines, only disrupt them. Thera leaned against her spear, her expression skeptical. How exactly do you disrupt a Spartan phalanx? Their lines are iron. They don't break, remember? Every wall has a crack, Lysias replied calmly. and I think I know where to find it. Kallias glanced between them. You want to attack their supply lines, he guessed. Lysias nodded. Their rations are brought in from the Peloponnesus. Grain, salted meat, water. If we cut that, we weaken them. Thera raised an eyebrow. And how do you intend to get past their sentries? They watch every road, every gate. Lysias smiled thinly. We go where they don't expect us. He pointed beyond the walls, toward the cliffs overlooking the sea. There's a path. Narrow and treacherous, but it leads around their flanks. From there, we can strike at their supply caravans. With enough damage, they'll have to pull back. Even Spartans can't fight on empty stomachs. Kallias considered the plan, his heart pounding with the thrill of it. It was bold, reckless, even. But it could work. If they could disrupt the Spartan supply lines, it might be enough to force their retreat, or at least weaken their resolve. How many men do we need? Kallias asked. Not many, Lysias replied. 20. 30 at most. Speed and surprise are our greatest allies. We hit them before they know we're there, and we're gone before they can respond. Thera's eyes sparkled with excitement. I'm in, she said firmly. We've sat behind these walls long enough. Kallias nodded. Me too. Lysias clapped them both on the shoulders, his smile widening. Good. We leave at dawn. The following morning was shrouded in mist, the pale light of dawn barely piercing the haze that clung to the cliffs. Kallias stood with Thera and Lysias, their small band of volunteers gathered around them. They wore dark cloaks to blend with the shadows, their weapons strapped tight against their bodies to prevent the clatter of metal. Thera adjusted the straps on her bracers, her expression determined. You ready for this? She asked, her voice low. Kallias flexed his fingers, feeling the tension thrumming through his veins. I don't think I've ever been ready for anything, he replied with a grin. Thera chuckled, clapping him on the back. That's the spirit. Lysias raised his hand, and the group fell silent. We move quiet, we move quick, he whispered. No heroics. Hit their caravans and disappear. If you get separated, follow the cliffs back. We don't stop for anything. The group nodded, and with that, they moved out. The path along the cliffs was narrow, the rocks slick with morning dew. Kallias kept his eyes on Thera's back, his footsteps careful and precise. Below, the Spartan encampment stretched out like iron veins, soldiers marching in perfect formation, their shields gleaming in the pale light. They reached the far side of the cliff just as the first Spartan caravan appeared in the distance, the wagons heavy with grain and barrels of salted meat. Kallias's heart pounded in his chest as they crouched low, waiting for Lysias' signal. The philosopher raised his hand, and Kallias's grip tightened on his spear. He exchanged a glance with Thera, who nodded sharply, her eyes alight with anticipation. Lysias dropped his hand. They moved as one, descending the cliffside in silence, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The Spartan guards never saw them coming. Kallias struck first, his spear piercing the side of a soldier before the man even had time to turn. Thera followed, her blade flashing as she cut down another. The Spartans shouted in alarm, but the Athenians moved too quickly. Within moments, the wagons were burning, the supplies reduced to ash. Kallias watched the flames rise, his heart thundering in his chest. "Move!" Lysias barked, and they retreated back toward the cliffs, disappearing into the shadows before the Spartans could regroup. They reached the cliffs just as the Spartan horns blared in the distance, the sound echoing across the plains. Kallias looked back once, watching the smoke billow up into the sky, and felt a surge of hope bloom in his chest. They had struck back. For the first time since the siege began, Athens had not just defended, it had attacked. And in that small victory, Kallias saw the spark of something greater. Hope. The Spartan encampments woke to chaos. Smoke billowed from their supply lines, wagons reduced to smoldering ash, provisions scattered and burning. Shouts echoed through the ranks as commanders barked orders, their disciplined lines faltering for the first time since the siege began. From the walls of Athens, Kallias watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding with exhilaration. Thera stood beside him, her eyes bright with triumph. "We hit them where it hurts," she whispered, almost as if afraid speaking too loudly would shatter the moment. Kallias nodded, his hands gripping the stone battlement. "They can't hold the siege if they can't eat," he murmured. Lysias joined them, his expression somber despite the chaos below. "They will strike back," he warned. "Spartans do not take humiliation lightly." Kallias met his gaze, unflinching. "Then we meet them head-on. One last stand." Lysias raised an eyebrow, a glimmer of pride shining through his fatigue. "You're ready for that?" Kallias turned to the city below, its streets lined with soldiers, blacksmiths, and citizens alike, each one sharpening blades, mending armor, preparing for the final clash. "We all are," he replied firmly. "Athens doesn't fall. Not today." The Spartan response came swiftly. Before the sun had fully risen, their siege towers began their slow, inexorable advance. The battering rams, reinforced and repaired, crept forward, flanked by phalanxes of hoplites, their shields locked in perfect formation. The ground trembled beneath their march, the air thick with the tension of impending war. Athens stood ready. Kallias and Thera took their places at the southern gate, where the iron-bound would have been bolstered with stone and steel. Lysias moved among the archers, giving last-minute instructions, his voice calm and steady despite the looming threat. "Remember," he called out, his voice rising above the clamor. "Spartans are iron, but iron can break. Hold your line. Protect your brother. And fight for every inch." A roar of approval swept through the ranks, and Kallias felt the fire of resolve burn brighter in his chest. He looked to Thera, who raised her spear with a defiant grin. "Ready to make history?" she asked. Kallias laughed, the sound sharp and unrestrained. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The Spartans crashed against the walls with the force of a hurricane. Siege towers slammed into stone, their gates dropping to release waves of soldiers onto the battlements. Kallias fought shoulder to shoulder with Thera, their movements synchronized, precise. His spear flashed out, striking at exposed gaps in armor, while Thera's blade flickered like lightning, swift and unrelenting. The walls shook with the force of the assault, but the Athenians held. Fire rained down from above, Greek fire igniting Spartan shields, forcing them back with screams of pain and fury. Archers loosed volleys of arrows, and Kallias watched as Spartan after Spartan fell, their iron discipline cracking under the unyielding assault. But they kept coming. For every Spartan that fell, two more took his place, their shields locked, their spears thrust forward in perfect harmony. Kallias felt the burn of exhaustion creeping into his limbs, the weight of his armor pressing down like lead. But he did not falter. "Hold the line!" Lysias shouted from the ramparts, his voice ironclad with command. "Athens does not fall." A cheer went up from the defenders, and Kallias found his second wind, his spear driving forward to meet the next wave of attackers. Beside him, Thera fought like a demon, her eyes blazing with defiance. Suddenly, a horn blared from the Spartan lines, a low, mournful sound that rippled across the battlefield. Kallias froze, his grip tightening on his weapon. "What is that?" Thera's eyes narrowed. "Reinforcements," she said grimly. Kallias's heart sank as he saw it, a fresh phalanx cresting the horizon, their armor gleaming, their spears upright like a forest of iron. "They brought more," he whispered. Lysias appeared beside them, his face pale but resolute. "We can still hold," he said firmly. "We just have to push back. One last time." Kallias glanced at Thera, who nodded without hesitation. "One last time," she repeated. The Athenians surged forward with a roar, their lines crashing into the Spartan phalanx with a force born of desperation and fury. Kallias fought with reckless abandon, his spear sweeping in wide arcs, his shield braced against the unyielding press of Spartan iron. He saw Lysias in the fray, his dagger flashing, his movements calculated and precise. Thera moved like a shadow beside him, her blade cutting through the gaps in Spartan armor, her movements fluid and deadly. For every step they lost, the Athenians took two more, their spirits unyielding, their resolve unbreakable. "Push them back!" Lysias shouted, his voice hoarse. "Push them back!" Kallias felt the surge of momentum, the Spartan line cracking under the unrelenting force. He saw their shields buckle, their formations waver. A shout rose from the Athenian ranks, triumphant, victorious. "Now!" Lysias cried. "Now is the time!" With a final, desperate surge, the Athenians broke the Spartan line. Shields shattered, spears snapped, and Kallias found himself standing amid the chaos, his breath ragged, his hands slick with sweat and blood. The Spartans were retreating. Kallias stared, disbelief mingling with triumph. "We did it," he whispered. "We broke them." Thera's laughter rang out beside him, wild and unrestrained. "We did," she shouted, throwing her arms around him. "We did." The cheers of the Athenians rose like a wave, sweeping across the battlements and crashing over the city. Soldiers embraced, weapons were raised, and for the first time since the siege began, Kallias felt the weight lift from his shoulders. Lysias appeared, his face streaked with blood but alight with pride. "You fought well," he said, his voice steady. "Athens lives another day." Kallias met his gaze, nodding firmly. "Because we fought together." Lysias smiled, the first true smile Kallias had seen from him since the siege began. "And that," he said quietly, "is how cities endure." Kallias turned back to the city, the fires of victory still burning in his chest. Athens had stood. Against all odds, against iron and blood, it had endured. And he knew, as long as its people held their resolve, it always would. Athens had not fallen. Athens had prevailed.